Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Video Penguin and welcome to another episode of For All Kerbal Kind, coming out every other Sunday, every 2 weeks. I say every episode, and yet still the most common comment is, when's the next episode, Beardy? This is literally the only series I think I've ever made with a release schedule, and yet it's still the most asked question. But yes, every 2 weeks, every other Sunday. Please stop asking. Anyway, we're joining Nina Kerman on another flight of the Kha-2, which we finished constructing in the previous episode, although this time we've actually shifted the wing position slightly and now it is a lot more stable at higher altitudes. I say more stable because it still sort of runs out of air for the control surfaces to bite into, but it is a very naturally stable aircraft, something I'm getting rather good at designing considering I've done multiple modules now on my course to do with flight mechanics and aircraft stability. So yeah, all of the aerodynamic derivatives and everything that are provided by Ferrum Aerospace are very, very pleasing to me. Still, we don't quite manage to hit 45 kilometers of altitude, which is what we need to hit for our current X-Planes high contract. We get within 300 meters of the 45 kilometer mark, Nina almost being able to reach out her hand and touch it, but unfortunately, we don't quite manage it. Another thing that actually happens that I didn't notice on this flight is we ran out of film for our film camera. Yeah, it turns out between flights you have to actually replace the film in the camera. I didn't realize that, so it turns out that on the next flight, trying to gather some more planetary photography science, this third flight of the Kha-2 with Vladimir, yeah, we don't have any film in the camera. Imagine this happened in reality. Launching a spy plane, experimental rocket plane, and you just forget to put film in the camera. But yeah, it turns out we don't actually get any science from this next flight, and once again we don't manage to get the 45 kilometer altitude mark. In fact, we don't get anywhere near close to it again with this configuration of the aircraft. So I decided to launch out over the Caspian Sea yet another time, this time with Raphael, and we actually have film this time in our early film camera, and we can get a veritable bounty of science, as Scott Manley would say, from the Caspian Sea and also from over the shores biome. We're actually getting science from all sorts of different biomes across the Soviet Union. So now we're going to launch Alexander, and this time we are launching to the south, which actually means we end up going into Iranian airspace. I'm sure they probably wouldn't mind, but unfortunately we don't head into any new biomes, so we get pretty much nothing from this flight. We can't unfortunately get any more X-Plane contracts until we complete this 45 kilometer altitude one. Even cancelling the contract, well, A, would bankrupt us because we can't afford to pay back the advanced payment since we already invested it in our space program, but also it still wouldn't lead to us getting new contracts. We have to complete this contract before we can really go any further. So we're just going to sort of take a little break from our Kha planes and launch some more rockets. So this is the second attempt to get the first pictures of Earth from space, although I guess it wouldn't actually be the first pictures since if we're following the timeline of reality, that was already done by the Yanks in 1946 on a captured V2 rocket. But still, this time we don't have a transient failure of our RD-102 engine right after launch, and we actually end up blasting up into space well above the Kármán line, and unfortunately just ending up slightly shy of the 500 kilometer mark, which is something we were also aiming for since we have got a record to break in that regard. But still, we have our film camera and we actually have a number of scientific instruments inside that little payload fairing there, including some biological samples, so some more mice, some more fruit flies, etc., trying to get as much science as we can. And still, recovering spacecraft from suborbital flights is actually the biggest sort of source of science from these missions. We're still getting quite a lot of science just from recovering stuff that has been to space, regardless of the payload on board. But thankfully, this second attempt at launching our SNAPS mission aboard our R5 sounding rocket ends up going absolutely flawlessly, and we get a very, very profitable contract from it. Although profit is not something we consider over here in the Soviet Union. Definitely. Regardless, though, we're going to grab ourselves another rather lucrative biological experimentation contract, get building another one of our R5 Snaps vehicles, and in the meantime, we're going to have one more attempt to get up to that 45-kilometer mark and try and complete this contract, because otherwise we're just sort of having the Kha-2 gathering dust in a hangar, not really earning us any funds. So I really, really wanted to be able to manage this with this aircraft, but unfortunately, Nina, still doesn't get anywhere near 45 kilometers. I'm not entirely sure how I managed to get quite so close with that first flight. Still, we've unlocked some new technology. We've actually unlocked some more materials science, which gives us access to aluminium stringer tanks. Tank technology is actually a rather important thing in Realism Overhaul, although we don't actually have enough time to apply that to our next launch of the R5. However, this time, since we don't have the early film contract, which requires us to go 200 kilometers downrange, we can launch directly up into space, and we just managed to get to the 500 kilometer uncrewed altitude mark. The actual force of the decoupler is what just takes the capsule over that mark. So we managed to get ourselves quite a bit of funding from that, as well as completing our biological payload contract. On top of that, we also get all of the science that we could get from this early film camera and this biological payload from space. So this will be our last launch of the R5, but it served us well if you disregard the rather catastrophic failure in the previous episode. But using the science from that final mission, we actually unlock ourselves the basic rocketry techno, which gives us access to the S2-253 engine, the RD-103 upgrade, and an upgrade for the XLR-11 engine, the engine which of course powers the Kha-2. So, with an upgrade to the engine and now removing that film camera, since we've got photos of pretty much every biome and all of our neighboring enemy states, we can finally try and break this 45-kilometer altitude mark with Vladimir at the controls. And this is a rather major upgrade to this engine. Although entirely replacing the engine takes quite a long time, applying an upgrade to one of the engines doesn't take anywhere near as long. So we managed to actually turn this around and get this aircraft launched really rather quickly. And with the increase in thrust and the increase in efficiency, we managed to blast all the way up to 56 kilometers, grabbing ourselves a 50-kilometer crude altitude record and finally completing that X-Planes High contract. Although we do sort of lose control of the aircraft a little bit. If we go much higher, we are definitely going to need some reaction control thrusters. But look at Vladimir, look at his happy face. He is absolutely thrilled to be the first Russian to go so high and so fast. And of course, we touch down nice and gently in a desert plateau. So next, we're going to grab ourselves yet another X-Planes High contract. This one for 50 kilometers, because we know we can reach 50 kilometers at this point, so it's just some easy money. Of course, Raphael at the controls this time, trying to spread the love amongst all of our different test pilots. We are flying a lot of plane flights during this episode. I think this episode will probably have the most out of any episode in this series, just because our rockets are still taking quite a while to build, and we can just keep launching these things and just completing contract after contract and getting ourselves a lot of funding, which we can pour into our space program. And of course, we now have so much funding, I thought we might as well invest some of it in getting a 60-ton rocket launch pad under construction. Now, it won't be finished until next year, but once that's constructed, we will have the capability to launch a large enough rocket to actually reach orbit. Next, though, we're going to grab ourselves a supersonic plane contract and a rather simple 28-kilometer altitude contract, which for some reason we got offered, even though we can rather easily achieve that. Because I thought, well, we might as well try and complete 2 contracts in one. Previously, we haven't tried any of these supersonic contracts because it requires you having to maintain a supersonic speed at a relatively low altitude for over 3 minutes, and we just haven't had powerful enough engines with large enough fuel tanks to actually manage it, although now the Kha-2 is more than capable of doing it. Unfortunately, though, we didn't quite have enough fuel left to reach 700 meters per second between 10 and 28 kilometers, which was the requirement for our second contract. I did try and see if we could reach 700 meters per second by just diving straight down towards the ground, and although we get infuriatingly close, we don't quite manage it. Lots of narrowly missing contract terms here. Perhaps we should have our lawyers negotiate the terms of these contracts with a little bit more leeway, you know, just a plus minus 5% or something on all of the different milestones. But nope, the lawyers are standing by their small print, so unfortunately we have to launch another flight. Nina Kerman once again at the controls, and we're doing yet another of our supersonic contract, followed by trying to complete our rocket planes contract. And this time we do actually manage to complete both contracts without a hitch, which is wonderful. And this is also the first flight where I thought I might as well try and see if we can land at the runway. Now, I wasn't planning to actually land on the runway itself, right? I just thought maybe it's time I started trying to experiment with the air launch and the distance from the Space Center and just see if I can land anywhere near to the Space Center. And we ended up pretty much more through luck than judgment, getting it almost absolutely perfect. You can see here, as we're gliding along, Nina spots a rather welcome sight. Yes, we are going to go in for a landing at the Space Center. Now, as I said, I was just intending to land with a parachute, but as I got closer, I thought we'd do some circles, bleed off some speed, and go in for a runway landing. Turns out this was an absolutely awful idea. The actual touchdown itself, although a little bit bumpy, was relatively okay. However, I didn't put any drag parachutes on this aircraft, since this was a rather last-minute decision to suddenly go for a runway landing. It only has a top-mounted parachute for emergency landings, and as such, yeah, it's not slowing down fast enough. And with us heading rather alarmingly towards one of the lamps at the end of the runway, I attempt to avoid it, fire the parachute, slow down, and Nina gets splattered across the runway. Our contract lawyers must have got a lot better though, because apparently briefly touching the ground still counts as returning home safely, and we fulfill our contract requirements. So Nina's death was not in vain, but I want 07s in the comments below saluting our fallen comrade, and also deepest condolences to our partner space program over in the United States, who also lost one of their test pilots just a month previously. But we shall press on. It is what she would have wanted, and what Gerald would have wanted as well. After all, this is a Cold War, but our pilots have the utmost respect for one another, and really it's more of a friendly competition. The politicians are the ones that hate each other. The actual flying men and women themselves, to them, it's for all Kerbal Kind, as is the name of the series. Anyway, with pressing on in mind, this is our R6 Reach, which we are constructing, which will be the rocket we are going to be using to try and fulfill the 3,000 kilometer downrange contract which we accepted in the previous episode. Now, the Amerikanskis did this last year, but that's mainly down to the fact that they have a much more powerful upper stage engine in the form of the Aerobee compared to our ORM 65 engine. So we're having to build a 3-stage rocket using our newly acquired S2-253 engine as an upper stage, because until now we didn't really have a viable upper stage engine, but the S2 has a rather high specific impulse, at least for an early engine, when it comes to its vacuum performance. So that's what we're using, an RD-102 at the bottom of the stack, and then an S2, and then the ORM 65 as a tiny little upper stage, and making sure each engine isn't going over its rated burn time to make sure that this thing doesn't, well, explode. Because we're really rather desperate to complete this 3,000 kilometer downrange contract, because we need to get it out of the way before we can start looking at the first satellite contracts. Extremely lucrative contracts with huge advance payments, which will be launching our space program into the satellite era. So really rather important we get this downrange milestone out of the way. Now, we're doing this as like the final step before we start going for orbital rocketry, whereas the Amerikanskis sort of gimped it, I guess, quite early on, just to get the payment, and then focused on the smaller, more simple sounding rockets. We've had a bit more of a natural progression, so they do things very differently, but hey, that's what makes this series rather interesting. Making use of the first set of modular launch pads there, because I thought they looked rather cool. So yeah, making use of that mod for the first time, and also we end up decorating this rocket it rather extensively with flag decals. But I'll go more over how the actual rocket is designed and how it actually performs when we launch it into space. Although we are now making use of those aluminium stringer tanks, which essentially use the outer walls of the tank to contain the propellant, but the structural loads are still supported by a frame and aluminium, stringers which run the length of the tank. So a step up from separate structure tanks we were using earlier, where you have the outer load-bearing walls of the tank and then an internal tank which contains the propellant, but still not really the same sort of weight saving as an integral tank where you have the outer walls contain the propellant and support the load of the rocket. Those we will be unlocking in the next episode. But you can see here the upper two stages of the R6 are actually spin stabilized because our avionics are still very, very heavy and very, very crude. So we just had that first stage tilt us over to 45 degrees just as it burned out, and then we hot staged our second stage engine and we spin stabilized the rest of the mission. Because after all, we don't need to really do anything particularly precise with this mission. We just need to reach 3,000 kilometers downrange with this tiny little Science Core probe here. As I said, it's a very, very small little upper stage here because I did not want to go over the rated burn time of the engine because that leads to some, rather explosive results as we've seen in previous episodes. And if this thing explodes, it's not going to continue on its orbital track until it reaches 3,000 kilometers downrange. And it thankfully just had enough performance to manage it. We also actually managed to get ourselves a 1,000 kilometer altitude record as well. So this is all in all a very, very lucrative mission for us, and it opens the floodgates for satellite contracts to come. We do end up exploding the stage over China though. Still, I guess there's some free fireworks for them. As long as the stages aren't actually being dropped through their roofs, hopefully they won't have too many complaints. Anyway, we now have unlocked avionics prototypes and we have almost all the technology we need to launch our first satellite. So we're going to be grabbing the two first satellite contracts, the first satellite and the first scientific satellite, giving us a huge advance payment of over 400,000 funds, which we are pouring into our space program, into the VAB and the R&D center, mainly because the VAB upgrades is actually what affect how fast our 60-ton launch pad is constructed, and of course the R&D center is responsible for unlocking the final tech node we need, which is satellite era materials science, which will give us those crucial integral tanks, which will finally give us enough weight savings to reach orbit with a 60-ton rocket. But that will be in the next episode in 1954 if all goes to plan, although I'm sure we may well have some other explosive failures. I'm making sure though that all of our R6 launches are using the same engines that we're going to use to actually put a satellite into orbit. So we're building up a lot of data on those engines to make sure that, hopefully everything goes to plan. Regardless though, we need a new aircraft to replace our Ha-2, and this is the Ha-3 Bolt. We're going to construct it, grab ourselves a 55-kilometer altitude contract, and send it for a first flight with Vladimir Kerman at the controls. It's pretty much the same as the Ha-2, except it has an extra engine, and with the XLR-11 engine upgrade, this thing has a pretty impressive performance. We managed to get all the way up to 65 kilometers of altitude, completing our contract with ease. I just sort of grabbed a rather low aiming contract because we've reached 55 kilometers with the upgraded Ha-2, but just to make sure, because I didn't know what the performance of this aircraft would be, just make sure that we get some funding, because we learned earlier in the episode aiming too high and then having an aircraft that can't reach a contract stalls your program for a fair few months. However, now we definitely, without a doubt, need to have some reaction control thrusters because the air is simply too thin for us to maintain control of the aircraft. Thankfully though, it is still naturally stable, and as soon as we get into the thicker parts of the atmosphere, we regain control of the aircraft, burning off our excess fuel and then heading in for another landing. Now, we are still aiming to land on the runway. You can see we actually added some drag parachutes this time and made a number of small improvements over the Ha-2, but I didn't quite calculate the air launch position correctly, so we ended up about 100 kilometers or so short of the space center. Still though, now we're going to add those reaction control thrusters to see if we can can maintain control of the aircraft. Now, it's not crucial. We do regain control of the aircraft as soon as it gets into the lower atmosphere, but I'd rather maintain control of it. You can see we actually lost control of it near the end of our burn of our engines. So the longer we can maintain control, the higher altitude we can reach. So we have all of our reaction control thrusters using high-test peroxide as their propellant, just adjusting the actual fuel load of that main tank, and we are blasting Raphael up and to see if this performs a little better. Now we have another contract, this time to get to 60 kilometers, and we know, well, this aircraft is more than capable of reaching that. Now, this time we do manage to keep control of the aircraft for a little bit longer, but the actual thrust of the engines isn't going directly through the center of mass of the aircraft because of course of the wings and the tailplane and the like, and of course that's not a problem when you're in the actual atmosphere, but as soon as you start to get closer to space, yeah, the actual thrust of the engine produces a torque on the aircraft which even our reaction control thrusters cannot correct for. So for the next flight we actually need to adjust the position of the main engines, just lift them up a little bit to make sure they're firing through the center of mass of the aircraft so that they do not spin us out of control near the end of our burn. Still, this time though, we actually managed to glide down to the space center. We managed to position the air launch just right, and we end up gliding down to the runway. This time, with some drag parachutes and with a little bit more experience under our belt, we touched down absolutely beautifully, setting loose the drag parachutes and slowing to a nice steady stop. It's a shame that it took Nina's sacrifice for us to actually learn how to land an aircraft, but still, this is a pretty massive achievement for me, considering I hadn't actually managed this before in Realism Overhaul. Landings are by far the most dangerous part of any space program. Anyway, we are going to launch yet another of our R6s. This is the Reach 2, and although we don't actually have a contract for this, it's rather an important launch. We're going to be launching this one directly upwards since we don't have any more downrange milestones to achieve. And we're going to just see if we can get some more altitude records, essentially just to pay for the launch. Because the main point of this launch, as you saw, we actually applied our RD-103 engine upgrade onto the first stage engine, and we also need to get some more data on that upper S2 engine. Because, of course, if we're going to be using these rockets to put a satellite into orbit, then that's going to be a rather embarrassing thing if we get beaten by the Yanks because our engine shuts down a minute into its burn. So the whole point of this launch is pretty much just to gain some more flight data on these engines and try and reduce the chance of them failing. And as luck would have it, we end up with an engine failure. Yeah, an ignition failure on the third stage engine, an engine which we've been using extensively. Yeah, this had a 4% chance of ignition failure. 4%. And it affected this mission. Thankfully, this was not a crucial mission, as I say. It was just to get a bit more engine data, but unfortunately that means that we didn't get any funding for this mission. We didn't achieve any contract or any milestones, but as I said, not a bust mission because we still got a lot of data on that RD-103 and that S2 upper stage engine. So this takes us to the final flight of the year, the Kha-3 flown by Alexander, and we're just doing another one of those supersonic test contracts. We didn't actually get another altitude contract that I thought we'd be able to achieve, even though we've now moved the position of the engines and so made this thing hopefully stable at high altitudes. We don't get a chance to test it this year, but perhaps in the next episode and in 1954 we will give it a run, see if we can get it all the way up to its altitude ceiling of 75 kilometers and perhaps even put a satellite into orbit. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I've been the Beardy Penguin. I do hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.